This is a story about a beetle.
So I like to start with a flying beetle. Flying around more or less randomly, looking for something that looks tree-like, crash into that, and then take a bite, see if it's a pine tree, see if it's something that they want to enter and try and establish brood in. If it passes that test, then they start chewing and tunneling their way into the tree.
But hold on a second. I think we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. It starts with a beetle.
Southern pine beetle is a bark beetle that attacks pine trees. You may have heard of the mountain pine beetle that's killing all the lodgepole pine out in western United States and Canada. This is a close relative, but it's found only in the south. Much of my early career was devoted to the southern pine beetle. My name is Ron Billings. I work with the Texas Forest Service as manager of forest health for the state of Texas. And this is a position I've held for almost 40 years.
So I'm Keir Klepsig, Assistant Director for Research for the Southern Research Station with the U.S. Forest Service. I've been a research entomologist working on southern pine beetle for about 18 years or so. Currently located in Asheville, North Carolina.
I'm John Nowak. I work in Asheville, North Carolina for U.S. Forest Service, a division of the Forest Service called Forest Health Protection. Southern pine beetle is one of the few native pests that we have in the South. Basically what it is a small beetle that is about the size of a grain of rice.
When I used to talk to school kids about this, they would correct me and say it's about the size of a grain of uncooked rice. I mean, it's tiny. But when it gets together with a couple thousand of its best friends, it has the capability of killing a tree and then another tree and then hundreds and thousands of trees and thousands of acres, ultimately a huge outbreak.
Millions or billions of dollars worth of damage. And it not only is economically devastating, but also can impact watershed habitat or wildlife habitat.
And it all starts with one tree.
That first tree is often attacked in the springtime. It's often a lightning strike that once the lightning hits the tree is essentially stunned where it can't put out resin, can't defend itself. So the first beetles have an easy foothold to get an infestation going.
And the southern pine beetle calls in other southern pine beetle using pheromone communication.
Pheromones by themselves aren't very attractive, but when they mix that pheromone odor with the odors of fresh resin, it draws in thousands of beetles that not only fill up that tree, but when that tree is fully colonized, any subsequent beetles go to the next nearest tree.
And this is the moment when the true battle between the southern pine beetle and the forest, or the southern pine beetle and a single tree, begins.
The tree can then produce a lot of resin, a lot of pitch or sap, whatever you want to call it, a big sticky gob of stuff that can trap the beetle and stop it from attacking any further. Or if there are enough beetles present to overwhelm the defenses of the tree, they can all get in and start reproducing.
While southern pine beetles are clumsy on flat ground, their skills at swimming through toxic, sticky resin are unmatched. They spend the first act of their siege on the tree working the pitch, or resin tube, using their body and legs to shovel the resin out into the open air, always maintaining a tunnel to their habitat beneath the bark.
So you end up getting a domino effect, one tree after another, until you have a 10 or 20 or 30 tree infestation, and it develops very rapidly. And meanwhile, you may lose your whole pine plantation.
And it was this kind of widespread devastation of timber plantations that first led us to notice the southern pine beetle. The earliest records stretch back to 1842, and since then foresters have struggled to understand and control this pest. In 1914, E.B. Mason stood before the North Carolina Forestry Association and said, "I do not think it necessary for me to dwell on the seriousness of the situation in regard to the southern pine beetle. There is not a man here who has not seen the appalling amount of dead pine." Indeed, for most of the 20th century, foresters continued to urge control of this devastating pest. This task led them to investigate the world of their proclaimed enemy. Andrew Delmar Hopkins was chief among these early investigators. He understood the connection between basic biological understanding of an insect and its control. In 1902, speaking generally about the study of forest insects, he said, "In this field very little is known compared to what there is yet to be learned. Especially this is true in regard to the life history, habits, and distribution of the injurious and beneficial species. Yet this knowledge is of the greatest importance in determining and applying methods of preventing losses." Hopkins had already started this endeavor in earnest for the southern pine beetle, and by the 1900s could describe in surprising detail the habits of the beetle, having spent considerable time studying it and its characteristic S-shaped galleries. Even before the turn of the century, Hopkins was exploring the idea of natural control with clarid beetles, or as he called them, bark beetle destroyers. He described this checkered beetle lying in wait beneath a piece of bark, waiting to pounce on a bark beetle. Over 100 years later, we know that the most important predator of the southern pine beetle is indeed a clarid, Thanasimus dubius. And Hopkins would be glad to know that that's not all we've learned since 1902. The clarid is joined by several other bark beetle predators, most notably Temnochila, a shiny green armored killer, and the hysterids, a group of black cylindrical predators that feed on bark beetle larvae. And as we look closer, it starts getting complicated.
The southern pine beetle is more than just a beetle. It's a whole microcosm. It's a symbiotic system. So as you have this beetle flying in and attacking the tree, it's not just the beetle. The beetle carries tens of different species of mites on its surface, under the wing covers, under the legs, all over this beetle. There's fungi that they carry with them in specialized structures called mycangia. And these are collar-like apparatus around the neck of the female, and these contain special nutritional fungi. So the mother beetle coming in, laying the eggs, at the same time inoculating the area around the eggs with these nutritionally rich fungi that the larvae can feed on. But one of the first clues that we had that nutritional symbionts were involved in the southern pine beetle life cycle is that if you look at how much their larvae tunnel through the phloem, they don't really eat enough phloem to account for their growth. And what they seem to be doing is taking advantage of the fact that the fungi can grow out and fan out through the phloem and capture nitrogen and nutrients and concentrate them in this luxuriant growth of spores. And they can just sit there and eat the spores, if you will. So these are highly adapted fungi for insect dispersal, completely dependent on the bark beetles for getting to the next tree. And what the beetles get out of it is nutrition for their developing larvae. Among the more important mites that the beetle carries are what we call these tarsonemid mites. And these mites very closely associated with the southern pine beetle, also very closely associated with the blue stain fungus that the beetle carries, Ophiostoma minus. This is a fungus that when southern pine beetle larvae are developing, it actually interferes with their development. It doesn't let the mycangial fungi, the nutritional fungi that they need to develop, it doesn't let those grow. It competes with those. And when you see the beetle larvae developing on the fungus that it brings into the tree, at the same time the mites are feeding on blue stain fungus.
So as the departing beetle tucks spores of its nutritional fungi into its mycangium, the mites are tucking away spores of the blue stain fungus and jumping on beetles like stowaways heading to the next tree.
So what you really have is a little fungal battleground going on under the bark.
It's a cool ecosystem, and southern pine beetle is kind of a keystone species in that insect community.
Yeah, the southern pine beetle has been studied for a long time. One might say, well, aren't we done studying it yet? We've been looking at this thing for 100 years. Don't we have it figured out yet? And the answer is, to a certain extent, yes, we know a lot about it, maybe as much as we think we're going to know to be able to control it. But the issue there becomes the conditions change all the time. We've got a changing climate in lots of senses of the word. Certainly temperatures are increasing. Precipitation can be down or more extreme. That alters the way in which we're able to deal with the beetle and deal with trees.
If you look at the most recent outbreaks, they've all kind of occurred on the fringes of what we would consider to be southern pine beetle range, southern Appalachians, New Jersey, and northern Florida.
Our current story starts in New Jersey. Not that New Jersey, or that New Jersey. This New Jersey. This is the Pinelands.
So the Pinelands is the name for the 1 million acre area that takes up a large portion of southern New Jersey. You think of New Jersey as being just one big suburb between New York and Philadelphia, but in the middle of it you have this island of green in a sea of urbanization and suburban sprawl and such. My name is Amy Carpati. I'm the Director for Conservation Science here at the Pinelands Preservation Alliance.
My name's Dr. Ken Clark. I'm a research forester with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. My duty station is here at Silas Little Experimental Forest, and we've been here working on national fire plan issues, climate change issues, and carbon sequestration issues since 2003.
Ken and Amy have watched as the southern pine beetle moved further north into New Jersey starting in 2008. In 2010, the outbreaks became more widespread, causing an epidemic of tree death that was predicted to destroy 80% of the Pinelands forest within 10 years if no action was taken.
I do certainly I worry about southern pine beetle, but I'm not quite sure to what extent we really should be getting involved here. We probably should be getting very involved in this.
So that would be the big question is, we know a lot about the southern pine beetle, we know what kind of damage it does, we know more and more as we study this more and more about its biology and ecology, but what can we do about it? What's the who cares? How can we help to save the trees?
And when we talk about saving trees from the southern pine beetle, our efforts fall into two categories: prevention before an outbreak and suppression once an outbreak is occurring.
So the number one way to control southern pine beetle is to not let them get going in the first place. And the number one way to do that is to thin them. You need to manage the forest, reduce the density.
And so we try to encourage landowners to thin when they're supposed to thin from an economic and also biological standpoint. You don't want to have too many trees in your forest or on an acre of land. They become stressed. They're less able to defend themselves from southern pine beetle.
Your dominoes just stack them very close together. And if you can thin those out, removing every second or third tree, it's good for forestry. The trees grow faster. If they start an infestation, it's less likely for that spot to expand.
So again, this is a native insect. This is not something that these trees are not used to dealing with. It's been a part of the system as long as they have. So keeping the trees healthy is a natural part of the life cycle of the southern pine beetle. And I think if we were not here, if humans were not in the forest trying to build homes in it, enjoy it, and live in it, and reap all of its benefits, which include water and fire protection and wildlife and aesthetics and all those things, that if we weren't trying to reap all those benefits, sure, let the beetles have at it, because they're part of the natural system, and the pines have grown up right alongside them, and they know how to deal with it. Sometimes the trees win, sometimes the bugs win. But because humans are here now, because we do have to control fire, because we do have homes in the forest, we can't just kind of let things go and assume that the southern pine beetle will play its natural role in the ecosystem as it used to, because the ecosystem isn't like it used to be. We have now, through our own intervention, stacked the deck against the trees being able to survive. We've put the trees in there so densely, and we've limited the options that they have to kind of deal with stuff to such an extent that we kind of need to step up and help them out.
Prescribed fire may play a role, because pine forests or pine ecosystems have always depended upon some low intensity firing, and so reintroducing low intensity fires can open up the stand and help maintain lower levels of competing vegetation.
People have such emotional connections to trees, and seeing trees die equates in a lot of people's minds to just destruction, permanent death, destruction of the forest. But that kind of qualification of the landscape being at its best when it's covered in trees is just a human construct. Who's to say that it's not best when a fire has just come through and there's herbaceous plants coming up. So it's hard as a conservation organization to try to figure out what stance to take.
Without thinning, without prescribed burning, without allowing some of these stand replacing events to take place, we've ended up with very, very dense stands of pine, which creates what we commonly refer to as beetle bait.
This ideal buffet for the beetles. In the 80s and 90s, we established wilderness areas, set them aside where no management would be done, and the beetles essentially wiped them out in less than 10 years.
In terms of suppression or controlling beetles once they're established, once an outbreak is occurring, number one thing is to cut out the trees that are affected immediately.
And basically what you do in those situations are you go into an active spot, you cut currently infested trees and a buffer strip of green trees that are alive and not yet attacked.
And it's hard to convince people sometimes to say, we need to sacrifice these trees, otherwise others are going to die. Because it's hard for them to understand we need to be able to take down these trees. So it's a real issue.
If you can, you remove those trees and get them out of the forest and hopefully get an economic return so it lessens the cost of suppression. But if you can't, due to access or environmental regulations or need for expediting the situation, you do cut and leave. And if it's hot enough, the sun will bake the beetles inside the trees and hopefully suppress that population from moving into additional trees.
By putting the brood trees on the ground, the survival within the trees isn't as high as it would be if it's left standing. And most importantly, by cutting that buffer tree, you're eliminating any fresh pine trees that the beetles can move into. And that's what the buffer does, disconnect that line of dominoes. And it's a simple technique, but it's been very successful not only in the South, but I've transferred that down to Central America, even more effective down there, Nicaragua and Honduras. Some beetles will survive, but you're forcing them to leave that spot in the summertime, at a very season that they have very difficult time starting up a new infestation. There's no more pheromone out there. They have to search around for another lightning-struck tree, call in all their buddies, and that's very difficult to do in the summer heat.
Suppression techniques work by making the early life of the southern pine beetle difficult, tipping the balance in favor of the forest. Luckily, human efforts have help from natural parts of the system, which already make the early life of the beetle a treacherous world. Remember our flying beetle from the beginning, who flew through the forest, landed on a tree, began to chew, and fought her way through the resin to lay eggs within the tree? Well, she was in the minority. Many larvae fail to get the nutrients they need to survive. Still others are eaten by the larvae of predators that squirm through the galleries, feasting on the immature beetles. Those who emerge and fly through the forest toward a host tree face even more obstacles. Spiderwebs hang between the pines, waiting for unwary flying insects like the beetle to trap themselves. And once on a host tree, a beetle is confronted by the fact that the same pheromones that drew it in will also attract predators, like the clarid beetle. As the southern pine beetle looks for a place to begin chewing into the tree, these predators lie in wait beneath shards of bark. While efforts have been made to raise and release predators to control the southern pine beetle, there has been little success. Instead, foresters have targeted another roadblock for beetles. The task every beetle taking off from its home tree must face: finding a suitable tree or ongoing infestation for colonization by following scents through the trees.
We've done some studies with tracer gases, simulating pheromone plumes. That if you release a tracer gas in a very dense stand, and you're simulating a pheromone plume here, it's more or less a sort of a snaking pheromone plume or tracer gas plume that goes through the forest. All the beetle has to do is kind of tack back and forth to keep on a track into that tree. If you do that same study in a thin stand, it's very chaotic. It jumps up and down. Large blobs of the tracer gas just go up into the atmosphere, never to be seen again. So if you're a beetle trying to track that, you might get a hint of pheromone and then lose the track completely and not ever be able to find it again. So on the one hand, I'm totally enamored with this insect, love studying it, fascinated by the way it exists in this interface between completely healthy trees and dead trees. It has managed to make a living out of that little ephemeral habitat. But on the other hand, the devastation that it causes, I can use that same knowledge of all of those little aspects of its life cycle to say, what's the chink in the armor to stop it? What little step in there, what interaction can we take advantage of and exploit to stop it from causing the devastation that it causes? Without that biological knowledge, we don't have a chance of controlling this insect.
Both a forester and an entomologist. And the forestry side of me understands that the forest resource is important to us as a society for a lot of different reasons. And it may be, that forest area may be what you were going to use to pay for your kids' college, maybe what you were going to retire on. It's harvesting your stand basically before you intended to do so. And it also has ecological impacts. On the other side of things, it's one of the coolest insect communities that you can think about. The fungal component and the bacteria and the mites and the parasitoids and the predators.
It's very freeing to know that much about an insect. Some of the work we're doing recently looking at the role of bacteria in the life cycle of the southern pine beetle. These are bacteria that produce novel antibiotic compounds we didn't even know existed. We've been able to really make discoveries that help people understand other bark beetles, understand other invasive insects, understand symbiosis in general. And now we've got new techniques, new partners, new opportunities to find out more.
And that's where our story ends, with this wealth of basic biology knowledge, with the unexpected and perhaps unintended offshoot of a cycle of devastation, research, and control. It all started with a beetle, with a tree, with a forest, with a decimated lumberyard in 1842, and a microscope a century later. But it all ends with a deep understanding of the world of a tiny beetle.